Judging by the response to the first video in this build series, yes, we did need another Tiger, and TAKOM seems to be on a real winner with this release. But before I start, a couple of corrections. I'm building the command version of the tank, and there is an additional aerial mount on the deck of the tank. This should be recessed and not sitting proud as I had it. The instructions do call out for a 6mm diameter hole, but I found that step very easy to misinterpret. It was an easy fix, however, by simply removing the piece, reaming out the hole and sitting the part flush as it should be. The plug on the gun mantlet on the command version should also be sitting flush, so a fair amount of modification was required in order for that to happen. Further to that, I should not have fit that coaxial machine gun in the interior, as this was where the additional radios were fitted in this command version of the Tiger. I also incorrectly stated the position of the bolts for the suspension differed between versions, however that was incorrect. It was in fact the bolts themselves that changed rather than their position. I also fitted the armoured shroud over the bow machine gun. I did leave parts off for the painting phase, so I'll claim that that was one of those parts.
Right.
I also puttied up a few gaps around the model to help present the Zimmerit in a more realistic way. And lastly, this is and always has been a drive sprocket. I believe I had a slip of the tongue in the first video. So thank you to Sam Dwyer and David Burden and a couple of others who reached out to share their knowledge and help me correct some of my misgivings. You may recall I'd dry fit the wheels and tracks in the first part of this build, and I did that in the hope that I'd be able to remove these assemblies to aid during the painting phase. I applied a generous amount of glue where the tracks touched the wheels and let them dry for around an hour. I could then carefully remove those assemblies in an entire piece. Glue had found its way onto a couple of the swing arms, so I had to clip them, but once the tracks are back in place, this will be all but impossible to detect. The other element I addressed prior to painting were the heat guards from the exhausts. I first sanded the thickness of the plastic down using a rotary tool and a sanding tube. The sanding helps present the moulded part with a more appropriate scale thickness. I could then heat it up over a candle and distress the symmetry to simulate knocks and bumps and a stray bullet, and unfortunately that video was nowhere to be found, so you'll have to take my word for it. The bumps and the lumps will just make for a more interesting element on this model. The scheme I'd chosen to tackle was the unique scheme of the 102nd Heavy SS Panzer Battalion. Looking at the instructions, you'd be forgiven in thinking the scheme was a hard-edged camouflage, but in reality the scheme was applied using a spray gun and should have a soft but tight lines in its shapes. I'd been debating about the best way to paint this scheme, and I'd even purchased a mask set to aid in the process. But again, the masks would give me hard edges when it should clearly have a soft edge scheme. One good thing about the mask set though was it at least gave me an idea of how to apply the scheme from above, which was a detail neglected in the TAKOM instructions. I finally decided I'd use a Blu-tack mask to define my scheme. The model would first need the Dunkelgelb or dark yellow as my base layer, just as it would have been applied out of the factory. I used the atom paints pretty successfully on my last build and was wanting to put them to the ultimate test on a 35th scale subject. The larger scale and far more complex scheme would allow me to make a completely informed decision on these atom paints. The paint was thinned to a 50-50 ratio and was applied through my 0.3mm Air Cobra airbrush at around 15 psi. I found the mix a little thin to start, so I was careful not to flood the surface, but to build the coverage up gradually. I added a little more paint to the mix to make it around 35% thinner to 65% paint, and that seems to give me a more solid and predictable result. In saying that, the official MO line is the paint requires no thinning to spray. I think for an overall coverage like the one I'm spraying now, that would probably have been okay. So my first real learning with this paint is different colours seem to respond differently to the thinner. I found when I was spraying the 4BO in the previous video, I could thin it more than I can this Dunkelgelb. In saying that, I'm now working on a far larger palette, so any variation in the paint coverage would be more obvious on that larger scale model. It's just an observation rather than a criticism. The centres of the wheels, both front and back, were blocked in with the dark yellow at this stage. I was then able to use the black brown to start blocking in the colour on the tracks. Again, this mix was around 35-65 thinner to paint. This seemed to give me a generous coverage at this blocking in phase, and I would imagine once I start highlights and shades, I'll be able to juice up my thinning ratios more. I'm not too worried about perfection here, this is only about setting the foundation colours. I was now at the point of no turning back, and the Blu-tack was rolled into thin noodles and prepared for the masking. The lengths were then attached around the model as best I could, trying to follow the plan. The concept behind the Blu-tack mask is that because it is round, it should slightly feather the edges of my paint, creating a tight but a soft edge to the camouflage. Once in place, Rotbraun, or red-brown if you like, was sprayed over the appropriate positions, following the scheme as best I could. The paint was thinned again around that 50-50 mix of paint to thinner to keep a good, consistent flow. When airbrushing any thin paint, it's important to control your paint flow, which is why the dual action airbrush is a must. Because the paint is relatively thin, if I was to dump a volume of the paint on the model, it has the potential to become a watery mess. By controlling the amount of paint that is going down, I can build the coverage up in a controlled way. I decided to concentrate on the hull section in the hope I could test the application of the pattern and get it to a point I was happy with. I then went back over the model, filling in the areas that required the olive green. I am a little more careful with the application this time to avoid any overspray onto the red-brown sections. The other thing that is vital when using this method of masking with Blu-tack is the angle and the distance you spray from. The airbrush should be kept at 90 degrees from the surface, as well as kept quite close to keep your lines tight and avoid any overspray. Again, controlling your paint flow is so important. Removing the putty was a step I didn't know whether I should laugh or cry. Yes, the masks held their shapes, but the lines were a lot tighter than I'd wanted, and it looked like the schemes in the instructions, but there was no getting around the fact it looked a little toy-like. It often happens in modelling when we come to a crossroad where we need to decide if we want to start again or if we trust in the process and press on with the plan, knowing it will be okay in the end.
I don't know whether to laugh or cry.
The technique was repeated for the wheels and the turret section also. I was feeling a lot happier with the scheme, knowing the subsequent layers would again have a bearing on the overall look. The positive was I had all my shapes in place, and the challenge was now going to be to bring it closer to my vision of what I was hoping it to look like. The plan was to now carefully retrace the edges of the camouflage shapes to feather the edges and create a more cohesive looking paint job. I started with the sections of the red-brown. This time the paint was heavily thinned to around 70% thinner to paint ratio. I'm doing this so the paint is more of a tint and the coverage can be built up using multiple thin layers rather than trying to blast the paint in one go. Doing this will give me greater control over this tricky application. When airbrushing like this, it's very important to have a clean airbrush. The tolerances are fine with only a tiny amount of paint being applied. A dirty airbrush will handcuff you with an application like this. I'm mentioning this because rather than stop and clean my airbrush, I tried to push through it. And when it came time to feather the green sections, I was having issues with the flow of the paint. All completely self-imposed, I'm sorry to say. I then did something that I'm sure will have the people at Ammo rolling their eyes, and I thinned the paint with a Tamiya retarder thinner. Interestingly, I discovered I was able to thin the atom paint with the Tamiya retarder thinner, which is a lacquer thinner, which I know essentially is turning the paint into a lacquer style of paint. But adding the lacquer thinner allowed me to spray and hold those fine lines a little easier. Yes, I could have and should have stopped, cleaned the airbrush, but why let good practice get in the way of progress? I wouldn't recommend thinning these paints with the lacquer thinner because it really defeats the purpose of spraying them in the first place. But for an application such as this, it worked surprisingly well, at least for me on this occasion. Adding highlights is something I love to do, but given the paintwork was already so busy, I was hesitant to do it. I neglected to video the process, but I was playing around with adding some highlights to the olive green sections using Rosita green. Overspray was inevitable with this feathering process, so a small amount of touch-up using the Dunkelgelb or the dark yellow was required also. Just like with the feathering of the other colours, this paint was heavily thinned, which allows me to slowly build up the opacity in that colour with just a couple of passes of the airbrush. Low pressure and well thinned paint with control of the paint flow is required to achieve this finish. One of the key features with these TAKOM Tigers is the beautifully sculpted Zimmerit patterns in the mouldings. The Zimmerit coating would often suffer wear and tear in the field, and the mouldings in these kit represent that detail nicely. One of the colours in the Atom range of German colours is Zimmerit. The colour was first painted where the moulded damage was sculpted, and the colour should be representing the chipped edges of that Zimmerit paste. It was interesting how the addition of this colour seemed to offer some relief to that vivid paint scheme. For those of you who don't know, Zimmerit was a paste applied to mid and late war German tanks and was designed to stop magnetic mines sticking to them. Irony was, the Germans were the only ones that actually used the magnetic mines. The paste was initially factory applied over the primed surface of the tank, and it was applied in two layers. A foundation layer and then a textured layer over that. Hence it would tend to chip in a few different ways. The top layer of paint could chip, exposing the brownish grey colour of the Zimmerit. The top layer of Zimmerit could also chip and expose the base layer of that paste. And further to that, the paste could chip off altogether and expose the primer colour of the tank. So thanks again to Sam for that Zimmerit application lesson through the week. A sponge was then used to add finer chips to the Zimmerit by dabbing it against the parts with only a small amount of paint on the surface of the sponge. Refinement is the key here because a heavy-handed approach will look unrealistic and overly obvious. I could then go back with the red-brown and colour in the middles of some of the larger chips to represent where the chipping had gone through to the primer. A lack of structure here is the best policy so the chipping doesn't become too predictable. I'd left some of the tools off during the build phase in order to help apply the camouflage pattern, but the tools I'd fitted were now painted using a fine brush and a mix of acrylic paints. Cork brown for the timber handles and black grey for the metal sections. These effects will be enhanced during later stages of the weathering. Moving back to the tracks and the wheels, and steel was used to paint the rims of the road wheels and the teeth of the drive sprockets. Trying to paint the wheels in the assembled state was a truly painful experience, and pre-painting them might have made this application far more palatable, but trying to glue pre-painted parts can cause its own issues. So it's important to remember that near enough would be good enough with these assemblies, because in reality most of the painting on the tracks and wheels will be lost behind layers of weathering. Tanks usually carried spare track links for running repairs in the field as good practice. However, the tracks also offered a line of defence. This Tiger has the racks fitted around the turret to house those spare links. The links that come with a kit have a small hole to connect with the pin on the rack. However, that hole should carry right through the way through the track link. I set about drilling the holes in those spare track links, however my cordless drill ran out of charge, and of course the charger was nowhere to be found. So rather than let that stop me, I headed back to the stash and dug out the white metal tracks I almost used on this build and pinched 7 links to use on this model. The links were first subject to a bath of VMS blackening fluid for a few minutes. I then gave them a scrub with a toothbrush. I find that the scrubbing helps move the fluid into the recesses of the links that can often elude that blackening process, and it seems to distribute the effect more evenly across the part, giving a satisfactory result. The links are then flushed with water to remove any excess chemical and stop that blackening process. I could then use steel rod to create my track pins. Adding the rod gives the spare tracks so much more character and adds another layer of detail to that assembly. I can then fit them to the brackets on the turret and glue them in place using super glue. The track pins had a small cap on them. A 1.2mm punch and a 0.5mm styrene sheet was used to represent that part. These punch and die sets aren't cheap, but they come in so handy for creating additional details around your model. The caps on the pins greatly enhance the parts and would make for a nice detail on the finished model. Whilst the blackening fluid was still on the workbench, a stiff brush was used to stipple it over the tow cables. I find this application uses far less liquid than trying to bathe the cables, and the result is far more controllable. The ends of the tow cables and jacks were painted in an iron colour and subject to 2 layers of chipping fluid. I then painted them in a Tamiya dark yellow too and proceeded to add some chipping effects to these parts. The atom paints do chip fine, but while I'm still getting a feel for them and this technique, I chose to use the Tamiya paints for this process due to its predictability. It would also give some variation in the dark yellows, which will be a good thing on the finished model. I could then go back and fit all of the cables and tools I'd left off earlier in the build, and then the model was ready for the weathering stage. With a few corrections taken care of and the bulk of the camouflage scheme complete, it feels like a logical place to wrap this video. Looking at those vivid colours popping off the screen is quite confronting, but is all part of the process, and this stage of the process is simply giving me my canvas on which to build my weathering effects. Executing a scheme like this takes a great deal of thought and planning. As modelers, we often find ourselves sitting firmly within our comfort zone and hesitate to try something new. Freehanding German 3-tone schemes is something I'm very comfortable with, but this particular scheme was something unique that I hadn't tried before. After going through the process of using the Blu-tack masks, I can't help but wonder if I would have been better off just trying to freehand the shapes. But in saying that, I think the masking at least established the foundations for the scheme, which made the finishing process that little bit easier. I've really started to come around to this scheme, or at least my application of it. It's amazing how introducing the chipping and then the tools and the cables help make sense of the paintwork. The thought of weathering these somewhat unfamiliar colours is a little intimidating, but as I've echoed before, this is a case of trusting in and following the process. I can't wait to show you how it all comes together. My Patreon page is now up and running and in full swing. A big thanks to my killer kangaroos, Lysander and Andrew. Thanks for jumping on board, and of course, welcome to my Wombat Warriors, Rodrigo, Craig, and Black Hat Scar models. Your support is greatly appreciated and helps me cover my costs in bringing you this content on a regular basis. Over on the page, I'm sharing regular bench updates as well as exclusive content, Q&A sessions and giveaways, so please be sure to check it out. I'd love to see you there. If I've added some value today, please remember to smash that like button and be sure to subscribe to ensure you never miss a video. And remember guys, this is the greatest hobby in the world. Share it with your family, share it with your friends, and let's be proud of what we do. Until next time, I'll see you soon.
It was very colorful.